Yeah, it said that the host ended the meeting, but I thought
Yeah, yeah.
I was the host. Okay, so let's at the moment I opened it again, and it seems to be working.
Yes, it seems to be working here as well. So I don't
Okay,
think there
right.
will be any problem.
Well, yeah,
More.
it's time, so let's see who is maybe 5 more minutes to so I can make some announcements. I think it should be everybody should be there.
Yeah.
Regina, what I was going to tell the class because Marcy is asking me about grading. So I will ask the group to write a short comment
Mm-hmm.
on a main reading for the course or one of the lectures, maybe a comment of about 10 pages. Does that seem okay?
I think it is. It seems also like, very good compared to like how um like a few classes we have actually, like in Hungary.
Right. Uh, I the other issue is that uh, Thursday of this week works, but Thursday of next week doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so Marty is asking when we should switch it to. I think the easiest thing would be is to do an extra Monday. In other words, instead of Thursday, uh, what is the date? 23rd or whatever that is. Do the Monday after.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask the group if they
Yes,
can
of
make
course.
if they can make it then. Otherwise, Tuesday we could bring it up to Tuesday before, but it would be hard to for me to do it then.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think, and also I would also ask others what they think about, but I believe that this commentary and a 10-page long commentary would be a very like, I don't have any other words but okay for like, it's a very good.
Okay. Well, it should be time, but now it's an even smaller group than before. Uh,
Yes.
it's almost five after, so it's actually uh, time to start, irrespective of who's here. So here is the problem. Uh, but it's not a problem. But I need to be able to grade the people who remain in the class, and and that means that I have to ask you to do something. And what my suggestion is going to be is to ask you to do a 10-page paper that you send me on any main reading of the course. In other words, a report or criticism of one of the readings. Or if you really want, you can also do the same with respect to one of my lectures. But I will need about 10 pages to be able to grade you. So that's the first announcement. And the next announcement is that uh, this Thursday, we can meet, and we will. But the Thursday after doesn't work because it's a holiday in the United States and I'll be traveling. So I would like to switch that session, the last session, uh, Thursday a week to the Monday after. I just gotta look at the calendar of what the I don't see a calendar on this program. So
Sorry to interrupt. I just realized that isn't Wednesdays the other days that we usually meet, or we decided to meet on
yeah. Well,
Wednesdays.
you can let me know, all of you, if that date is okay. At the moment, I mean, it's three students, so four students, so I'm not quite sure what the uh, whether others will join us or not. But it is for those who respond, is up to them to decide. Okay, so let's start irrespective. It's late and not too many people are here. I gotta do a screen share. Oh, where is the share screen? Share. Okay. So what our interest today is to place the problem of regime backsliding or democratic backsliding or de-democratization in a theoretical context, and that I want to do both abstractly to begin with and then historically after that. So as far as the abstract scheme, what you see in front of you is a scheme introduced in 1992 by the Hungarian political philosopher János Kiss, who was also perhaps the most important democratic oppositionist in the last phase of the old communist regime. I changed the scheme because he has only 4 boxes, and of course I have to place backsliding within it. But the basic principles he introduced I keep, namely legality continuous, legality rupture, that's one variable, and legitimacy principle continuous, legitimacy ruptured as the other variable. Legitimacy here means the most important symbolic organizing principle of a regime. So in the case of both being continuous, what he first introduced, and I follow this, is the idea of reform, which was a category all over the world in different historical periods, but also in the Hungarian case, which he analyzed. Revolution, which is an old historical problem since the 17th century, is conversely a form in which both legitimacy and legality are ruptured. Assuming legality, continuous legality, and a break in legitimacy, he then introduced the negotiated transition, which was the model that in 1992 he diagnosed not only in Hungary, but in several other places, Poland, Bulgaria, then Czechoslovakia, South Africa was not yet included by anyone in this categorical framework. What I immediately introduced is another, because logically there is one aspect, one possibility missing, and namely legality ruptured and legitimacy continuous. Under this heading, I introduced the idea of coups and self-coups especially. Now, what he did not then deal with, and I initially didn't pay so much attention, is that all the forms could be in a democratic direction or in an authoritarian direction. This is clear in the case of the old historical pair of revolution and counter-revolution, right? Assuming that revolutions are democratic for the moment, counter-revolutions are almost always authoritarian breaks of both legality and legitimacy. The category of coup, self-coup, almost always is understood as authoritarian, But there are people in the literature thinking of a couple of cases like Honduras in the 1990s, and then Peru very recently, where coups can be seen as democratic preservationists. In other words, their purpose is to overcome an authoritarian setting and prepare the ground for a democratic outcome. That is a very minor a change in the scheme. Much more important for us is that reform, in other words, continuous legality and legitimacy principles, can lead in two directions. One of them is our own problem of backsliding. I left it a little bit open whether backsliding should be introduced under a reverse direction for a negotiated transition. I would think that at least self-understanding of the actors involved could imply that the negotiated transition model is being continued. But I think it is much more reasonable and much more likely to introduce the category of backsliding as a kind of reform in the opposite direction. In other words, continuous legitimacy, continuous legitimacy, continuous legality, and continuous legitimacy principle. Now, after I introduce these categories abstractly, and of course, in reality, as any student of Max Weber would know, reality, some of these forms can appear in a mixture also. In any case, once I introduce them, the problem of revolution becomes the most significant background concept for trying to understand our current dilemmas in many places. There was a period, I think would say the 19th century, where many people interested in political progress, and of course in the Marxian tradition, also in social transformation, focused on the problem of revolution. The prestige of the French Revolution was so great that until I would say very recently, no one who's interested in change could escape that particular prestige. So that you see, for example, in the case of Bolsheviks, constant talking about their relationship to the French Revolution and so on. But you see this in all the socialist movements, anarchism too. You see it in a diverse set of contexts. I would say until the 20th century, almost all of them European, but from the 20th century on, the concept of revolution and its prestige moved to other parts of the world. I would say Latin America, it was always present since the French Revolution. So it wasn't just European in the 19th century. I need to correct myself. But in terms of Asia, it was the 20th century. Think of the so-called constitutional revolutions of Turkey and Iran, and of course then China, where the concept of revolution has played a great role in Asia and has played a role in Asia ever since. Now, given this prestige, to be a critic of the revolutionary process took a lot of courage, at least on the democratic side. Democracy was associated with democratic revolutions by a great many authors. Nevertheless, from the point of view of our course, one can demonstrate that historical revolutions almost always involved an authoritarian cycle. If you actually think about the French case, from 1789 to 1799, already you would have the beginning of a cycle in which a constitutional republic was first created, replaced by a radical process which led to a dictatorship of the Committee of Public Safety, which in turn was itself overthrown, leading to a restoration of the Republic. And the Republic itself, in 1799, led to yet another coup and another authoritarian turn. Of course, you all know the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was associated with it. That cycle in France, if you're interested in French history, which should not be our topic here, continues in the 19th century with another revolutionary turn in 1830, an authoritarian interpretation or monarchist interpretation of that revolutionary process, which itself is then broken in 1848, which by 1851 again leads to a authoritarian turn, again associated with the name Napoleon, but this time Napoleon III. So the authoritarian cycle in the French Revolution is not only indisputable, but overwhelming. I think those of you, and I think everybody here should at least have a little knowledge of Russian history who know it, would know that there is also a cycle in Russia. I would say three important steps. Initially, the February Revolution, which established a constitutional project. Dual power was the outcome of the provisional government and the Soviets. This is overthrown in October 1917. Whether it's a revolution or a coup doesn't really much matter in terms of this description of a cycle. The revolution initially, however, leads to a democratic election of the Constituent Assembly, which itself is then overthrown in 1918. And you could say, if you really want, that even from that moment on, a cyclical pattern persists in the period of, if you want to call the names, war communism, a rather authoritarian period, to the new economic policy, which is a period of at least more open experimentation on the social and economic side, to the Stalinist turn, which again is an authoritarian turn in the cycle. I don't want to talk about other great revolutions, but this model is right for all of them. You're reading Hannah Arendt, who introduces the problem in a way that still attempts to save the concept of the revolution for democratic change. She doesn't like the word democracy too much, but doesn't matter. Hannah Arendt, interestingly, thought that the epoch of revolutions is going to dominate the 20th and perhaps the next century too. This thesis, I think we need to criticize and revise. Her whether this is optimism or not is another question. But Arendt developed the concept of revolution in terms of a model of the two revolutions. I think if you're reading the book, and that's the book that I thought at the very least all of you should read for this session, you will know that the prototypes are not the French and the Russian, as I just illustrated the idea of a cycle with those two, but rather the French and the American, the Russian being in the tradition of the French Revolution. What the thesis of the two revolutions suggests that there are two outcomes of the great modern revolutions, one with a cycle and one without the cycle. The American does not produce a cycle of political regimes subsequently. Most obviously, I already illustrated it, the French and the Russians do lead to such cycles. Hannah Arendt's explanation was that the purely political revolution is like the American, and it is protected from the cycle by the fact that it is pluralist to begin with. The French revolutionary model for her is political and social, and it is the insolubility of the social question in her view that leads to the cycle. She does not use the word populist, but her depiction, as you'll see in a few seconds, is of a model which anticipates at least contemporary ideas of populism. Now, Arendt's thesis was almost not at that time followed by anyone, but it is indirectly demonstrated by the political, scientific, and sociological literature of revolutions, which in the period of the 1970s and so on confirms the idea that most modern revolutions lead, in spite of their democratic aims, lead to authoritarianism. Theda Skocpol, who does not explicitly say this, demonstrates that the great modern revolutions now, starting with France in her case, the Russian, the Chinese, and then she wrote a separate piece on the Islamic Revolution in Iran, are all lead to what she calls state strengthening, but which in her actual description is a subtype of authoritarian outcomes rather than democratic one. Interestingly enough, the American Revolution does not appear at all in Skocpol's work. Of course, it was entitled States and Social Revolutions, and the American was not understood even by Hannah Arendt as belonging to that subtype. The case of America, by the way, it need not be treated as an exception to the authoritarian logic. Yes, there is something called the American Revolution by the actors themselves, but if one describes it, in terms of what actually occurred, it was just as much a process of secession from an empire by already formed political entities, the 13 original colonies, which were internally not radically transformed, even in the political sense that Arendt stresses during the American Revolution. So what Hannah Arendt notes, that there is only one revolutionary tradition, namely the French, is more or less correct, in spite of the fact that she wants to include Hungary in another tradition, Hungary in 1956. But I was, of course, present during that particular historical set of events. Hungary doesn't count one way or the other because the revolution of October 1956 does not succeed and lasts. Its successful political outcome lasts only for less than a month. There is, however, a tradition of secession from empires, which Hannah Arendt neither Hannah Arendt or Theda Skocpol would be interested in, because it does not fall into the strict category of revolution change, even as I have illustrated it. It involves, for example, legal continuity from the British Empire. Nevertheless, it was a successful secession and a radical transformation. India, in this sense, does initiate a tradition, but that is a tradition of decolonization, which after India spreads through not only Asia, but even more radically, given the number of countries involved, to Africa. But this is rarely understood as part of the classical level. These secessions are rarely understood as belonging to the revolutionary tradition. Now, I said that that Hannah Arendt's argument for why the French revolutionary process goes wrong introduces the notion of populism, or at least categories which we today associate with populism. In her more historical context, populism at the time had a much more limited meaning. She associates with Jacobinism, which in the French Revolution is perhaps in its radical phase, the dominant political stream. You know, the leadership of Robespierre, Danton, Marat is the Jacobin leadership that is criticized radically by Hannah Arendt. What is wrong with this tradition is ultimately its fictional idea of the people. The people, everything is in a name, everything that is done is in the name of the people, but the people as a single entity, as a single will, was a fiction, did not exist, and could not exercise in a unified way what the famous constitutional theorist, the Abbé Sieyès, called the pouvoir constituant, the constituent power. This unified constituent power never existed. It was a fiction which was attributed, which was claimed on behalf of a variety of leaderships that led the revolutionary process, but most famously the group called the Jacobins. Now, what was problematic about this tradition for Hannah Arendt was the deification of a fiction, which then legitimated in the same way that religion legitimates the dominance, the authority, the actions of an elite or a group, a kind of priesthood, if you want to continue this metaphor of deification, the priesthood of the revolution that speaks in the name of the people and wishes to derive governmental power and legal structure ultimately from this author, this fictional author, in whose name they speak. The American alternative in this context was to understand, of course, the Americans also spoke about the people, we, the people of the United States, in the famous lines, but the people are understood as a plurality, if you want, the peoples of the various states, and even perhaps more radically of the various townships that Hannah Arendt stresses. The alternative, the single source, the single actor, the single model, creates political outcomes that cannot be sustained. They're built on air, as Hannah Arendt argues. The democratic constitution of France lasts only a year, or if you want, the liberal constitutionalist constitution of 1791 lasts only a year. And even more interestingly, the democratic constitution of 1793 lasts 0 years because it is never implemented. The Bolsheviks in this respect did one better. They did not wait till the creation of a constitution through the Constituent Assembly, but dissolved the assembly in the first place. So constitutions built on populism are built on air. That does not, of course, stop the various actors and advocates to stress constitutional constitutional politics. But that constitutional politics does not lead to anything like constitutional government. But I think in this sense, the term of Trotsky, permanent revolution, which of course he would not have applied to what happened in Russia after he is gone. The permanent revolution is a description. Hannah Arendt stresses the authoritarian meaning of revolution and permanence, which of course would mean the cycle, in the sense that revolutionary processes bring down both stages of the cycle and make any outcome temporary. Two discussions, one of which I will not discuss today, take place with respect to this history, which are noteworthy. In terms of intellectual history, the most interesting discussion is the debate on revolution and reform within the tradition of social democracy. I would say the German protagonists are the most famous, but the same discussion occurs in Russian social democracy too, and indeed in all the social democracies of Europe. The debate on reform and revolution. I will just stress the German dimension of this. I don't think that he is historically the very first to advocate a non-revolutionary democratic thesis, but his is the most famous. Edward Bernstein, in English, the book title is called Evolutionary Socialism. The German title was Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus, the presuppositions of socialism. In any case, he argued, he thought on the basis of some possible remarks in Marx, and I think it's right that there were a few lectures or a few speeches of Marx that justify this, and much more on the basis of the work of the late Engels. Bernstein was his secretary, scientific secretary for a certain moment, argued on the basis of these forerunners that the only secure road to socialism, as it was understood at the time, namely democratic controls over the means of production by either the workers or society as a whole, or the two in some kind of combination, only secure rule to that outcome, which is understood as a democratic one, radical democratic outcome, is itself a democratic process. Revolutions are authoritarian. Historically, Bernstein is on very strong grounds, even before the Russian Revolution, to argue this. And authoritarianism leads to more authoritarianism, as the French Revolution has already demonstrated. So the road must be democratic, based on suffrage. Universal suffrage is the key concept. Marx has written on universal suffrage and generally advocated its achievement and defended it to some extent when it was achieved, but he never argued strictly that universal suffrage, universal, originally understood manhood suffrage, but of course in radical thinking that's universal suffrage of men and women and everybody at the age of possible exercising the possible franchise. That suffrage for Marx was something to fight for as a step in the revolutionary process. For Bernstein, it became the main form in which the revolutionary process, the supposed revolutionary process, but now calling it a revolution, would be achieved. You see already in terms of my table here that Bernstein moves socialism from this box down here to this box up here. And he firmly believed that through not just use of the universal suffrage, but to the victory of a working class party in elections, you could step by step, incrementally introduce more and more dimensions of a socialist economy. As I said, it was a debate. Lots of social democrats, that was the name for socialism at the time, debated Bernstein. Karl Kautsky was at that time the most famous. Lenin too has written against Bernstein, but I think the most brilliant critiques are given by Rosa Luxemburg in a text called Social Reform or Revolution, where what she argued basically was that purely reformist politics never leads to where we're going. It leads to only adjustments within the capitalist system. It leads to a more, perhaps in some respect, more humane capitalism, although Luxemburg never even conceded that. But in any case, cannot lead to socialism or the outcome. So, in a way, social reform, as Bernstein understood it, is inimical to a socialist outcome. Luxemburg, in particular, postulated the very great ability of capitalism to integrate small changes as it has developed. In this sense, anticipating a great deal that was to come. It's interesting that Rosa Luxemburg is Stein, but she's also a critic of Lenin. Maybe is her writing on the Russian Revolution, where she criticizes the Bolsheviks for something I already mentioned, namely the dissolution of democratically elected constituent assembly. Luxemburg thought that that will subvert the socialist projects also. So in a way, her position is located someplace between Bernstein and Lenin. It would be an interesting question to ask, who won the debate in light of history? Bernstein turns out to be prophetic in terms of the history of revolutions. At that time, basically the French is the model to which everyone is referring to. 1848 revolutions failed, including in Hungary. The Russian Revolution was not yet relevant. So it is the French Revolution that his critique is based on. Is it sustained by subsequent revolutions? I think that the Skocpol book, in spite of her intentions, demonstrates the kind of outcome that Edward Bernstein feared. But what about Luxemburg's prediction, namely that reformism just leads to a better and better organized and perhaps in some way a more legitimate or more integrated form of capitalism, but still capitalism? I think that the history of social democracy could be used in the Scandinavian countries, in Germany after the Second World War, could be used to support that thesis. The two great traditions within the history of Marxist socialism, eventually Bolshevism and social democracy, both wind up where their critics thought they would. Now, are both of them equally negative from a historical point of view? I think that there would be few of us who would say that Stalinist Soviet Union is a preferable social model to social democratic Scandinavia, say Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and so on. But better or worse is not the point. The point is that from the point of view of all the socialists, the survival of capitalism is a fundamental problem, and capitalism does survive under this social democratic forms. Now, the second debate I wanted to focus on, this is the one I really wanted to stress today, not only because the class is in Eastern Europe, but also because it was the one that led to a yet another model, is the critique of revolution in the East European countries. I would say that initially this critique occurs primarily in Poland. I'm not sure at this point if the names of the most famous writers, Adam Michnik, Jacek Kuron, are still even known to most of you, but it was these authors and an organization that they called KOR, Committee in Defense of Workers, that developed the post-revolutionary radical position that gives us a new entry in our overall model. Again, in our boxes, it would be the box indicated by legal continuity and radical change. This is the model that Janos Kish himself adopted. I think it is interesting that originally this thesis, as you can see in Adam Michnik's writings, is first and foremost focused on the reconstruction of civil society. Revolutionary transformations lead to authoritarianism, says Michnik, and this is now after the Russian Revolution, so hindsight is, of course, 2020, not only there, but also in the countries of Central Europe, authoritarian outcomes are demonstrable, and they were to this group. But if it cannot be revolution, then perhaps another option is needed, and this was the famous reconstruction of civil society. I've written a lot on this. We even have a big fat book, which is not in, but it's in some languages, not in Hungarian or Polish for that matter, but lots of essays, including in Hungarian, that I've written are available in terms of that particular model. What I think became clear with the failure of the first Solidarity, 1980 to 81, that the civil society-oriented strategy cannot on its own lead to the outcome of any kind of regime replacement or regime change. You can rebuild civil associations, but they remain vulnerable to the holders of political power. You know, of course, you must know, right, that it was that power that led to the martial law regime in Poland in 1981, bringing to an end the experience of the first Solidarity. So one must focus not only on civil society using these old concepts, but also on the state, or if you want, on the governmental structure within the state. That too has to be transformed. Initially, even Janos Kish, in something called the Társadalmi Szerződés in Hungarian, the social contract, thought that the more radical change would occur on the level of civil society, and a more limited form of change would complement this on the state level. But by 1989, that idea became obsolete, as you, of course, all of you know, starting with Poland, the round table of 1989, and then Hungary later in that year. A Nemzeti Kerekasztal, that would be the Hungarian term for it, became a venue at which radical changes were negotiated. It's interesting how this process, reform and revolution were the most famous concepts of change in European history since the 19th century, especially these Marxist debates or social democratic debates. A new name was needed for this process. Timothy Garton Ash, if you know the name of this author, who is still a professor someplace in Britain, Oxford, I think, called it revolution. I don't know how you would translate that particular term into Hungarian. Reform. Reforradalom would be the term. I can't even pronounce it, reforradalom. But this was never played a role in Hungary, at least. Michnik himself, as I said, called it new evolutionism in his model. Later, it became called self-limiting, velvet, negotiated, or constitutional revolution too. The the term that Laszlo Brust, whom you probably know as a professor in Hungary, used is negotiated revolution. Jacek Kuro used the term self-limiting revolution. And others use different terms, but in any case, the idea was that this will be revolution in some sense, but in other respects, avoid the destructive model of revolutions. Now, the key to this model, as it has developed, was, as I said, the round table model, kerekasztal. In Hungary, we're peculiar in this respect. We had two kerekasztal. We had which language am I speaking? We had two round tables, or két kerekasztalunk volt, az ellenzéki kerekasztal and the national, nemzeti kerekasztal, so the round table of the opposition and the national round table. Why was there need for a round table of the opposition? As against Poland, where the opposition was powerfully united under the banner of solidarity, Solidarność. In Hungary, there were a variety of groups with different ideologies and different political programs and even different models of change who had to be brought together so that negotiation with the political powers that were still in place would be possible at all. So the purpose of the opposition of the roundtable of the opposition is to bring together the groups to constitute a single actor. But of course, they had to have then the same kind of roundtable as the Poles, namely negotiate with the power holders. This fact of negotiating with the power holders, which is a very important contrast with classical revolutions, was denounced from the beginning. In Poland, it was called a bargaining between Reds and Pinks. Well, this was a small group in Poland outside of Solidarity that made the charge. I think in Hungary, the quasi-revolutionary critiques came also within the most important actors at the opposition roundtable. I'm thinking of István Csurka. I don't know if the Hungarians still remember this name, but he is the most important ideologist of this kind of denunciation of elite bargains, which he himself and his parties actually participated in. This was a populist or quasi-revolutionary critique, and it had one important concept, which I think first was coined in Hungarian, átmentés, but became translated as conversion into at least English and perhaps other languages too. The idea was that elite bargaining would allow the older power holders to convert their power into new powers. In other words, they would stay in place under a different name. So in that sense, the transformation of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party to the Hungarian Socialist Party, or MSZNP to MSZP, was an example of such a conversion. And though, of course, not all leaders could convert their initial leadership powers, many of the important figures of the MSZNP in the Hungarian case, in the Polish case, Jaruzelski and so on, could convert that power in the next stage of development. And this was the basis of the fundamental critique. I say to begin with, and I written on it even at the time, that the critiques, though had a real point, at the same time neglected the fact that important principles of legitimation were linked to this process. Important principles of legitimation, which I would say not just legitimation, but also legitimacy. In other words, real normative justifications. Legality is one. And, why should we value legality over illegality? But I think you have to remember that legality represents a principle which allows different people to plan their conduct from the present to the future creating a certain degree of certainty, a certain degree of reliability in social life, and especially if the legality that is being preserved is that dimension of the system which was less authoritarian than others, then the continuation of legality is an important principle. More importantly was plurality. I mean, this is the Arendtian concept of contrasting America to France. The revolutions, generally speaking, destroy plurality. But plurality in complex societies is a value. We're different. We have different forms of life. We have different associations. We have different cultures, different ethnic, cultural, gender qualities. And plurality means that not just one group that at the moment holds the most guns on the oppositional side, but all groups are admitted into the process. It's really the value of democratic inclusion, which cannot occur on the basis of one person, one vote in a complex society where people are grouped into factions, parties, movements, and the rest. So plurality was an important value. And of course, plurality could lead to anarchy and to impossibility of coming up with a solution. Another value, and it was clearly articulated in the Hungarian roundtable, but certainly in the Polish one earlier anticipated, is that ultimately decisions would be made by consensus. In other words, you could outvote some members of this plurality, of the pluralistic framework of associations, but outvoting them is not going to be the way that an outcome will be produced. Rather, the attempt will be to try to convince them, and in principle, this would be the argument, ultimately validating some kind of idea of deliberative democracy, is that everybody has a second best. That is, perhaps around the first best, you can never come to any agreement or consensus, but perhaps a second best would allow you to do so. And that second best, in the cases of these roundtables, was constitutional democracy. Now, that, of course, is an old claim of liberalism, right? Is that liberal democracy is better than other forms of political life because it allows contending political forces to remain in contention, to be able to come back some other day. You lose an election one year, but you can organize, and if you do it well and appeal to sufficient number of people, you can win the next election. In this sense, the consensual idea of the second best was one that was normatively a significant one for the roundtables. It is better than liberal democracy as such, because liberal democracy always means there can be winners and losers, and sometimes a majority remains permanent. In other words, the losers never get their chance to come in and to make their contribution to an outcome. The consensual idea of the roundtable, however, said basically there is no losers. We all contribute. And you can see, if you actually examine the history of the Polish roundtable or the Hungarian one, that this consensual idea was maintained. Now, of course, the critics don't go away. Consensus among whom? It is among elites. It is an elite bargain. And in that sense, the consensual model, the pluralistic model, is still exclusionary and still, in some way, from point of view of some groups, repressive. And of course, to the extent that you can show that consensus leads to conversion, to Átmentés, then of course you will believe, if you argue this, that the process, even if it has legitimacy claims, it is ultimately not a legitimate one. The way that the roundtables could answer that particular objection was the two-stage model. Interestingly enough, it's never articulated until South Africa. So if I have stressed in this context Hungary and Poland, which were the first such roundtables, and of course one could go further back and perhaps focus on the Spanish transition a decade before. None of them actually suggested that the problem of elite agreement, because of its legitimation gap or legitimation problems, needs to be supplemented or corrected. The South Africans knew this. I think that their processes of negotiation in two stages in Johannesburg, World Trade Center, Johannesburg Multi-Party Negotiating Forum was their particular term for the second version of this, was more inclusive in terms of different social groups than anything that you have seen in Eastern Europe. For example, radicals on both sides were included in the South African version of the Round Table. That meant, of course, white supremacists on the one side and African revolutionaries on the other side. Nevertheless, even their inclusion allowed the bargaining process to succeed. But what the South African transformers did was to create a second stage of the process, which would no longer be representable as an elite bargain. My topic with respect to this set of changes was always constitution making. What is interesting that the South Africans explicitly suggested that two constitutions would be made, an interim one by the Round Table itself, which would then provide rules and establish the democratic procedures for the making of an ultimate constitution. The Hungarian Round Table did have this idea to some extent, because in the end, the actors called their agreement to amend the inherited communist constitution, radically amend it, perhaps even transform it, was only a temporary solution, and there would have to be a constitution-making process. Poland, to some extent, satisfied the two-stage model, and South Africa did as well. Hungary did not. So that leads me to the question, can a negotiated transition go wrong? One of the things that one can say from the outset is that it can go wrong if it does not achieve the two-stage model, if it remains a single stage. And from a point of view of constitutionalists, that would be perhaps a way of describing how such a process can go wrong. But most people, of course, would not be convinced that constitutional issues are the most fundamental in such a context. And I think we can say, examining the careers of, for example, Churka and the most radicals within the Hungarian Democratic Forum, or the careers of the Kaczynskis in Poland, or many actors in the South African case, I think that probably will find this dimension everywhere, is that there is a kind of populist challenge from the outset, which is linked to the negotiated transition. I represent their views as the views of the critics, but these critics have a chance to become stronger and stronger when the expectations, the economic and political expectations of the negotiated transitions are disappointing. In this sense, the most brilliant participant in all these processes is Viktor Orban, because he's one of the architects of the negotiated transition. As you will know that Fidesz was initially not even included in the process of the Hungarian Round Table, and the other parties, Hungarian Democratic Forum, Alliance of Free Democrats, refused to participate unless Fidesz is invited. Fidesz were the radicals on the liberal side. Viktor Orban is their leader from the outset, or most important figure, and he is, in the sense, a symbolically important participant in this process because because he initially begins as a liberal reformer, radical liberal reformer, and winds up as a leader of a populist movement. He eventually comes to this view, although by degrees he has come to it even earlier with the electoral defeat of 2000 and 2002. In any case, the dimension of populism was present before his turn in the Hungarian case, and it was present in all the other cases. Now, the presence of people who want to bring a process down does not in itself bring it down, or does not in itself lead to backsliding. Another important dimension of what happened is the emergence of the Constitutional Court, especially in Hungary, but elsewhere too, as a significant actor in the process. Most importantly in Hungary, because if the constitutional process is not completed, then someone must complete it. And this was the view of László Sólyom, the first president of Hungarian court, who saw himself as a revolutionary. They're just reformers, he said in one speech. I was actually present when he said this. We're the revolutionaries. The court is revolutionary. Another way of putting it is that the pouvoir constituant is now in our hands. Since society is not exercising it, or has already exercised it in some partial way, we will complete the job. It's our job. My friend Agnes Heller, for example, even told me, don't criticize them. It's their job to make the Constitution. I strongly disagreed with that. Courts can play an important role in completing a process, but to replace the process, I think would be a fundamental mistake. István Csurka always pointed this out. This was his big point, that the court has stopped the democratic actors from transforming the society. He was focusing on a system of property on the one hand, and a system of political responsibility or retribution on the other. And he thought that the court was interfering with the populist project in both of those domains. You'll find similar things in the Kaczynski episode, or the history of the Kaczynskis in Poland, and you'll find similar dimension in South Africa too. You might have thought that I am a sort of contrasting South Africa as the positive model to Hungary and Poland as the negative ones in terms of their outcomes. But one has to be very careful with this, because South Africa from 2008 or so to 2017 has its own very powerful populist episode. It has a remarkable two-stage process that brings Nelson Mandela to power. Like George Washington, he does not wish, he's the least populist of all the leaders, does not wish to remain in power after 2 terms. In South Africa, the Constitutional Court also did play a really fundamental role in the process, though never making a claim of replacing the constitutional power, which in the two-stage process was would have been fully unjustified. But in any case, by 2007, 2008, and I think one can demonstrate this also already earlier, a populist challenge emerges, and it is connected to the name of Jacob Zuma, who becomes the president of the African National Congress and who becomes the president of the South African state by 2009, I think, if I remember that date correctly. What is most significant about South Africa, that president who's engaged in a process of radical state capture, trying to take over almost all the institutions of the state, all the investigating organs, the treasury, the bureaucracy, were all taken over by Zuma via the ANC, which is the first entity that he manages to capture. The South African process moves in a perhaps more authoritarian direction than anything that we have seen in Hungary and Poland. What is really interesting, however, is that the episode, the populist episode, comes to an end, or at least Zuma's project of authoritarian populism comes to an end. Again, I could mention some constitutional differences. The South African Constitution of 1995 makes amending the Constitution very difficult and replacement almost impossible in democratic ways. This, I think, Hungarians should remember as the formal contrast between the two outcomes, one having a two-stage process and one omitting the second stage. But what is equally important, and of course this is constitutionally grounded, is that although there's a radical attempt at capture on the part of South African populism, equally radical to a Hungarian or the Polish, or perhaps more radical, it fails in one respect. It lacks one thing, namely the South African Constitution doesn't enable the president, Jacob Zuma, to fully replace or fully pack the courts. So the Constitutional Court of South Africa remains viable and active through the whole process. And if a constitutionalist would argue that this is the key to the fact that the South African outcome does not succeed, he would or she would have to concede that a court on its own or a newly appointed court, which is in part newly appointed, cannot alone be socially significant in reversing the actions of the elected branches. In other words, the president, and in the South African case too, the president could rely on the big majority of the legislature too. I would say that if you wanted to really contrast these cases, first you have to ask the question: why is there a serious populist episode in all three? Can we blame it on the negotiated transition itself? Well, it is true that all these countries have negotiated transitions, but the populist episode is less successful in the cases of some and the others. So if you have serious populist episodes, one would have to examine also the differences in outcome and how they should be, how their causality should be evaluated. And of course, revolutions themselves have an important element in common with the populist phenomenon, as I have already argued previously. I think one key constant that one needs to stress in this context is the neoliberal economic policies. We associate the neoliberal economic policies with the Central European countries readily. Shock therapy was a term first used in Poland. The bait and switch strategies of left-wing parties that promised relief from inequality and disruption, and then continue the same neoliberal strategy, is common to all the Central European countries. And of course, the international context, which supports, which influences internal economic policies, is key. With this, one can explain the emergence of populist episode in all the settings, but not the different levels of success. The different levels of success is where the distinction between a completed negotiated transition and an incomplete one or unsuccessful one comes into play. Now, why can't? Here's the question: why can the courts be packed in Hungarian case and not in the South African? How come that a new constitution can be made in a Hungarian case, but not in Poland and not in South Africa? It has to do with the completion of the initial process in the two cases. A radical, legitimate completion in South Africa and a much more problematic one in Poland, and a non-completion in the Hungarian case. And then I think the civil society problem is the second dimension, where I think one needs to produce an explanation. Whether courts, judges, jurists who are politically, by their nature, cautious could stop the political branches or not depends on the kind of support that they have outside. In the South African case, at least, one can show that the populist authoritarianism of the Zuma period is strongly resisted by actors in the various provinces of South Africa, but even more importantly, within the organization of the civil society. Why is the South African civil society so much more active than the Hungarian one, and even more active than the Polish one? That becomes the fundamental question. Now, in each of these cases, elections ultimately decide the result. In the South African case, Zuma loses an election within the ANC, the African National Congress, that picks Cyril Ramaphosa as the candidate for next president. Zuma was pushing his wife, Dlamini Zuma, as the candidate, but she lost, and the ANC removed Zuma as a candidate for the next presidency. So elections play a role, and then, of course, the national election plays a role too. Previously to the national election, local elections already presented the African National Congress with the threat that in the next national elections it will lose. So it removes its own leader instead. In Poland, and when I was first working on this comparative topic, I could not have said this. Poland, too, an election now occurred, and it led, at least it seemingly has led, because we don't know the outcome yet, to the replacement of the populist regime. They won only 2 elections in the South African and Polish cases. In Hungary, however, 4 already. And so the question will be, how come that the 3rd election in Hungary did not have the result, or even the 4th, as the South African elections and the Polish ones too? And here I think, again, 2 variables: the level of state capture or governmental capture, and the resistance of civil society have to be taken into account. I think it is probably fair to say that with the courts untouched, the level of capture in South Africa is lower than in the Polish and the Hungarian cases. So the level of state capture, which in the Hungarian case is built on also the making of a new constitution, is the most complete in Hungary. The Polish case less complete, because although the society is in many respects transformed, the survival of other political parties and of formal separation of powers within the institutions is significant. Only a genuine constitutional replacement could have achieved that goal. And finally, again, the not only the level of capture, but also the level of response on the part of society is important. Here, I think it's important to stress the difference between civil society and public sphere, because one significant difference, if one would compare South Africa, Poland, and Hungary, is the existence of a free printed media, the much more significant survival of printed media in the South African case, somewhat more successful one in Poland than in Hungary, and the weakness of alternative media communication in the Hungarian case. In all three cases, the electronic media of radio and television are captured. So there is something common among the three cases with respect to that. But given the organization of society in all the three cases, at least the printed media survive in a more extensive and more significant way. In the South African case, in the Polish less so, and in the Hungarian case, it's the weakest. Now you will ask, why not the new media, right? Why am I not stressing the new forms of social communication? Why focus on these old media, radio, television, and printed newspapers, which also appear, of course, in the new media through an electronic version. But I focus on these because they are still important. I could imagine a world in which they will be displaced by forms of bottom-up social communication, but this has not occurred. The number of people who watch television debates, for example, in the United States, among political parties, is still extremely large. The electronic media, especially for age groups above 40, remains still the much more significant way of communication than below. For young people like yourselves, perhaps this has already changed to a significant extent. But even on that level, fake news or the capture of a significant number of websites and forms of communication by political powers is a real issue. And it is not entirely clear that the authoritarian project of today become powerless, especially when they have internationally supported platforms like TikTok that allow for the creation of alternative news and the representation of developments in a way that supports and legitimates authoritarian outcomes. Next week, we will talk about the role of international resistance and international limits to backsliding and to authoritarian outcomes of the types that many of you experience. But for today, I'm done. Thank you. I'm sorry for going on a little long. Please tell those who are not here today that they can listen to the lecture if they want in a recorded form that you can find on probably our website, and Regina will tell you probably in some way of accessing it in the Hungarian context as well. Okay, so the floor is open to your questions. I will remove the share so we see each other better. One thing, let me start with that, because new people here who are not here before, I'm going to need a short paper in order for me to give you a grade for the course. Paper doesn't have to be longer than 10 pages. You're free to select one or two authors from the reading list who you can compare or you can analyze or criticize. You can also focus on one of my lectures if you want and produce some kind of response to it, using some text and bringing other things in if you wish. I will need 10 pages, and I would say, I don't know, Regina, tell me if this is going to work, that I need to have everything within 10 days after the last day of class, of this class. When will the grades be due, Regina? Do you know?
I'm not sure whether this is a seminar or a lecture. If it's a lecture, then it can go on until I think January.
Oh, well, okay, we don't, no, I will hand in grades. I will hand in grades very quickly once I get something from you.
Mhm.
So 10 days after the last session. The other issue was when will the last session be? Because Thursday, a week from this Thursday, is not good for me. Oh, how will be the Monday, 2 weeks from today, be for most of you for the last session?
For me, it's not gonna work because I have another lesson that so I already skipped one to attend
Okay,
this one.
all right.
So
So
for
it's not
me,
going to
that's not
work.
working. But if
Right?
for others it's working,
Well,
then
here, well, I mean, if you really want to hear it, you can hear it on tape. So I think for one
yes,
person,
yes, of course.
but yeah, so if it works for the others, then I will do it then. That's the easiest because to fit it into a week from tomorrow, Tuesday, would be hard for me. Although if there are a couple of more people who can't make it on a Monday, then I will do it for that day. So is anybody who cannot make it 2 weeks from today, aside from Regina? Okay, so let's leave it for that. That will be the makeup class. So for next week, we will have one class on Monday, and then the week after, one more class. Right, and I think uh, well, I have to think about what the topics are each time. I will inform you because I'm getting a little confused about now the two courses, New School and Budapest. But I would say that can I do this? Here is the thing.
Can I question?
Yeah, I'm losing myself here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh,
So,
okay, good. Oh, good. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah, I come back.
so the lesson, is it possible to include a closely related topic in our commentary with which we can complement or straighten it, but it is related to the topics of the lectures. So what as dissertation lesson between a lesson and a dissertation and a bridge or so what can connected with dissertation.
You know,
Do you understand?
I'm not getting the point really, but are you talking about your dissertation?
So can I so writing from yours theme what connecting with dissertation? So not so book or newspapers cikk, elfelejtettem angolul a cikket.
Well, I mean,
So
I'm
what,
complete-
so can I
journal-
show writing like a theme, but connected with my dissertation's theme?
That's fine, absolutely fine, absolutely fine. Everybody here will write something on the basis of what they know and what they're doing, and might as well be a dissertation. So that's fine, as long as you can demonstrate some relevance, right? I mean, I'm not very demanding about this, but some relevance to one of the topics that came up in this class or one of the texts that came up in this class. If you can do that, that's fine. I mean, I'm
Okay.
interested, just to see that the class has some effect on what you do, right? That's the important. I could say it in Hungarian if you want me to make it more clear. Akarom tudni, hogy a kurzus valamit jelentett önnek, és föl tud a kurzusból valamit használni
Okay.
egy olyan témára, aminek van relevanciája ebben az esetben. De hát teljesen, I'm completely free. You can do it any which way. I just want to see that we're interacting, that we're having a dialogue, that we are exchanging ideas in some way.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No, there's no problem. The only thing that if let us say you write me a short presentation on agrarian problems in Hungary between the two world wars, that would be, even that, actually, if you think about it, you see, I thought of something, but it's wrong. Hungarian populism, or the thing that has been called népi politika, népies politika, emerged from an agrarian context. So if you wanted to, I'm open to almost anything, really, as long as it's not manifestly unreasonable. Okay, so that's
Thank
fine.
you very much.
I just want to see that we're interacting in some way, and the course of lectures or the readings, because it doesn't have to be me. It could be Hannah Arendt, or it could be Theda Skocpol, or it could be Thomas Frank, whom we'll be reading next time or the time after. So it could be an author from the course who really makes you really think, and you want to interact with that. That's fine. Doesn't have to be me. It's not a narcissistic thing on my part. It's rather that I want this thing to have had some effect on what you're doing.
Thank you
Okay,
very much.
So that's fine, yeah. Okay, any other questions, any issues? It looks like we're going to meet the 2 Mondays. Next Monday, I looked it up now. The topic will be the place of international law and international politics in backsliding and in authoritarian turns. And then the last session will deal with an author who postulated the right to democracy and whether international institutions should enforce democratic agreements, treaties, desiderata, or regulations. So that those are our next 2 topics. And the floor is open now to you to ask me about anything that you so far thought was a problem or relevant or interesting. Okay. Oh, yes. Miss Eren, or first name is Nazan. Please,
Nazan,
yes.
actually. Nazan, thank you so much, Professor, for the presentation and your speech. But beginning of your presentation, you mentioned about decolonization as a revolution. I would rather, could you please elaborate what is the relation between, how do you put link between the decolonization as a revolution? I would like to hear more about it.
That's great. Now, today, in an epoch, in our epoch, among the intellectual paradigms that are available to you, the post-colonial paradigm has become really important. And I don't share the idea that every single context can be best explained through a post-colonial critique of contemporary institutions, or the critique of colonialism's role in the emergence of contemporary institutions. In some sense, this can, of course, be done, even for a very small country like, say, Denmark or Norway, because, you know, everybody participated in some way in colonialism. But I think I like to focus on this issue in a more narrow way. And I did before, when I mentioned India in that context, which is clearly a colonial setting. It's not only a colonial setting, by the way. And those of you who know something about Indian history, you will know that it has a long imperial history too, and history of many empires. The British colonial version is just the last one. But it is the last one before the emergence of modern India. Indeed, it is the one under which modern India begins to emerge. So you can't deal with Indian history, even if you want to understand Modi today, you can't just neglect the colonial past. You don't have to be a post-colonial ideologist or a post-colonial theorist, like, for example, Partha Chatterjee or others, you know, who I know, to say colonialism for India is all important. So in India, the problem becomes simultaneously transformation and independence, right? I mean, social transformation. If you look at the programs of the Indian National Congress, you will see that social transformation is always part of it. That's Gandhi's idea too, not just the Congress main leadership. At the same time, independence of India, Swaraj was the term, is a central focus too. So simultaneously, two things are happening. Something which revolutionaries are motivated by, namely transformation of the society, and India has revolutionaries. And the other is the nationalist movement, which is focused also on transformation, but above all on independence, And in that sense, India is the forerunner. But as I said in the lecture, this forerunner status leads to a particular model of transformation, which is within legality of the British imperial order, and at the same time, a social political creation of a new regime. So India, in this sense, where would you put India in terms of my little graph on top? You would wind up putting it in a box where legality is continuous. At the same time, the changes are radical. Now, when you enter into the world of decolonization, which you're asking about, it becomes clear that different models are available. We think of decolonizations as revolutionaries, but wasn't South Africa's transformation also in effect a decolonization? I mean, the rulers of South Africa up to 1990, or let's say up to 1992 or 3, are descendants of a settler society, right? Descendants of a settler society against whom there's a nationalist mobilization resembling the Indian one. The fact that they are called African National Congress is not an accident. India has a very big influence on the South African development. And nevertheless, in South Africa, a modality of change occurs, which could be similar to the Indian, but it's much more similar to the Hungarian, Polish, Czech, Slovak, Bulgarian negotiated transitions. So whereas in the Indian case, it's unclear where one would include it in my boxes. In the South African case, we would include it clearly in the in a negotiated transition box, right? I mean, that would be my view. The changes are of a revolutionary type, but the method of change is a negotiated legal transformation. Okay? Now, is this generally correct for Africa? I think there are, correct me, those of you who know, I think there are over 50 independent countries in Africa today. Now that means North Africa too, right? If you count them this way. So Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya will also be part of Africa in this sense. But even if you don't count the North, which is so different, it's 50 countries or so that have transformations. And the modalities of all of them are different. That would be a very interesting quantitative study that could come out of my class, is to see how many African transformations are classical revolutions. I don't want to say zero. Hannah Arendt is not right. The 20th century does not become a century, doesn't remain a century of revolutions, but there are some revolutions. Iranian one, for example, is a classical one in many respects. So some of the African transformations, some of the decolonizations are revolutionary. They're movements, and these movements are so powerful. Algeria would be the classic. North, right? I didn't even mention it before when I mentioned the North African countries. Algeria has a clearly revolutionary process in which, in the end, negotiations occur, but only in the form of concessions by de Gaulle. So Africa has negotiated decolonization. Africa has revolutionary forms of decolonization. It also has negotiated transition, South Africa. And I would say in some cases it is the reformist process steered by the colonial power that accomplishes the transformation. So I would say, and then of course, the fourth category, coups. I would say there are dozens and dozens of coups within the model of transformation. So you could have a model that begins as a revolutionary, as a reformist form of decolonization, or even as a negotiated one. But these processes can be then disrupted by coups, military takeovers, self-coups, autogolpes. And I think that, I don't know, this would be something for a statistician to examine, that at least a third and possibly as many as half or even more of the countries of Africa have a revolutionary transformation to begin with, a negotiated one, a reformist one, but at least half of them, this process is disrupted by a coup. A coup that could be a military one, or it could be one based on a regional organization linked in the tribal structure. And so in this sense, decolonization cannot be just simply linked with the revolutionary box of my scheme, nor even of the regime change box. Decolonization in Africa takes place through almost all these means. Now, the interesting question would be, what are the consequences of following one mean rather than the other, or one method rather than the other? I think, by the way, that in spite of the fact that I stress South Africa here, negotiations, not with the settler population, because not every African country has a huge settler population, but negotiations in with the colonial power characterize almost all the British ex-colonies. So negotiated transitions for Ghana, for Nigeria, for other British colonies, Southwest Africa too, which is interesting because of the South African influence, belong to the negotiated model. So decolonization not only fits into all these boxes, depending on the context, but sometimes combines boxes, involves a combination of the boxes. But my thesis is that it is the negotiated transition that is the most positive for democratic development. Now, South Africa is my case that I presented in that context, which is a case of perhaps arguably decolonization too. But would be interesting to take a look at, just to see. One would have to spend a lot of time at empirical and quantitative work to actually list the revolutionary cases, list the cases which are reformist processes steered by the colonial power, and list the truly negotiated cases like Southwest Africa and South Africa. My prediction would be, but this is something that could be wrong, it's just a hypothesis, that democratic consolidation is more likely in those cases where there's negotiation than when there is an initial revolutionary takeover. And my hypothesis would be that subsequent coups are more frequent in cases where there is a revolutionary takeover initially. And perhaps where there's a purely reformist process steered by the colonial power. So coups would be more frequent for revolutions and reforms and less frequent for negotiated transitions. That would be a hypothesis that would have to be tested. I don't know, I'm not an Africanist, so it would be difficult for me to really test it. But I think if one gets a book on African decolonization, which focuses on the process, one could probably, even on the basis of a single study, examine whether there is some validity in this hypothesis. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer, Professor.
Does it convince you, my answer?
Actually, I have another question. Even if it was a negotiation when they have a revolution in itself, is there any, I mean, of course, there's a representation problem, but how can we come up with the democratic, how can we call it as a democratic revolution in this case, even inside in itself as a representation problem?
It's fascinating the way you're asking it, because you're already making me realize that I'm not being Weberian enough. I'm more a follower of Max Weber, at least in terms of method, than Karl Marx. I like Karl Marx as a theorist very much, but Weber, I think, gives you more methodological clues. The clue is ideal type. So once you define things into my 4 boxes, what have you done? You have just produced an ideal type. You produced an abstract model. So how does reality fit in? Well, one answer is not perfectly, never does perfectly, right?
For sure, yeah.
The second is that in reality, things appear in combination. And that's what I hear in your second question, because you said negotiation followed by revolution, you said. And that, of course, is a real possibility. You negotiate with the Brits, what is the name of the place? Chatham House. There's always one palace where all these negotiations occur between African nationalists and the British government. It's not Chatham House. It's another name. I'll think of it. But Zimbabwe has one like that. I think Kenya has one like that. Maybe Nigeria has one like that. So there are negotiations. So let's assume the negotiations create a timetable for independence. But your question makes me think, who is going to rule during the independence process? Or who's going to rule after the independence has been formalized? You know how they do it. The British queen, now it's going to be a king, but the British queen goes up in the African city and ceremonially presides over the end of British power and so on. That's the formal thing. That's the end of the negotiation process. But it is not the end of the process, because somebody comes to power. Now, that power could be someone who already was a revolutionary previously. Think of Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, the first president of free Kenya. He was a revolutionary. He was the leader of the Mau Mau movement, who is jailed by the British. And as part of the negotiation process, he is allowed. He's given his independence. I'm hoping for such outcome for Bhagwan Marguti, or Marwan Barghouti. You know who Marwan Barghouti is in the class? Does anybody know the name? He's a leader of the PA who has been jailed by the Israeli government and has been in jail for quite some time. But he has quite a prestige among the PA, and he could actually play a role if he were allowed out of his prison. Well, Kenyatta was the Barghouti of his own day. He's allowed out of prison. I'm not trying to identify British colonialism and the Israeli state, but I'm just suggesting that prisoners can come out of jail and become leaders of a new government. And I think and in his case, it was his revolutionary credentials that allowed him to become the head of state. But what if after independence, there's an immediate coup d'etat or an immediate revolutionary takeover? So in a way, negotiation can be combined with revolution. Now, your question is relevant still, because is a revolutionary continuation of the process compatible with democratic outcomes or not? Or is it likely to produce a democratic outcome? And my hypothesis would have to be, no, that's not the right way. I think that once there is independence achieved, then the initiation of a democratic electoral process, that's Marwan Barghouti's position also, by the way, for the Palestinians. So you could take that position even in that current context. And I would say it would be not the rule of Hamas after independence of Palestine, but electoral democratic process that would have a better chance in creating and consolidating. I mean, Hamas doesn't even have a democracy in mind, so it would not be surprising, right, in that particular case, if an undemocratic outcome would follow. By the way, their rule in Gaza is undemocratic. They have come to power, I think, about 9 years ago, and do not allow any kind of...
Yeah, with one election, and then they stop having an election.
That's it, right? So they no more, right? So so you know that if that kind of power comes to power, then democratic outcome is not. They wouldn't even say, because they don't say they're Democrats. They would say their interest is creation of a Islamic community. But anyhow, you can see my point is that the negotiation could be followed by different processes. Reforms, they would have to be followed by some kind of change, because it's not enough to get the Brits or the French out, right? What you also need to do is to slowly create a process by which a new government, a new structure is formed. That would mean making a constitution. Almost all African countries after independence produce a constitution. What kind of constitution? Who produces it? What kind of political process will be organized under it? These become the interesting thing with negotiation in a decolonizing context is that it's only one stage. I mean, once the Brits are out from India, how much role do they have in what kind of state the Indians are going to have? I don't say zero role, because economic influence, advice, criticism can play a role, but basically it's the Congress leadership that helps to construct the constituent process. They make a new constitution, and that new constitution allows for a purely Indian process to develop, which has changed a lot over the decades since 1948, almost 100 years now, right? But in any case, the first step was a negotiation, and then negotiations, by the way, in Indian case, already 1930s. Even Gandhi wound up in London negotiating, didn't succeed, but the Brits then created a kind of mixed process by which the states of India became much more autonomous. That was negotiation followed by a kind of colonialist reform, and then comes the decolonizing. So this is the process is, Nazan, if I can call you by your first name, I really appreciate the question, because it makes me realize that my ideal types can be combined, and colonization is exactly when they are combined. But what the combination is, which methods, which procedures, which processes are combined with what, makes a lot of difference. That would be my thesis. And that's what you said too, because you said if a revolution follows, then the outcome for democracy may not be too good. If a coup d'etat follows, it's even worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Ms. Pinter, were you raising a question or no?
Thank you very much.
These double names, I always call you your first name. I think that would be correct, right?
Eszter.
Pinter is your,
Uh,
what do you like to call yourself?
Eszter.
Esther, okay. Well, first name solves everything. So Nazan and Esther. But you can call me Andrew. You know, we don't need to have too formal a process.
Thank you very much. In the auf Deutsch, so németül mondtam. So in
you should say it in Hungarian because my German is pretty good, but from Hungarian I can translate just like that. So you ask me in Hungarian.
Szóval az egyetemen így szoktunk a doktori suliba beszélni egymással, hogy a keresztnevén szólítjuk egymást.
Okay, she just said that it's okay in Hungary too to call each other by our first names. So keresztnév, that's interesting. You know, so languages are so funny. In English we say first name.
Yes, I know.
Hungarian says keresztnév, which
Igen,
of course
igen.
is cross name, right?
Yes.
Because that's the name that we were given during our christening. Now I have Jewish parents, but I was christened. So András is my keres name.
Sorry, I'm still not sure about that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Siri.
Oh my God, somebody, well, you know, AI is talking. Somehow I pushed a button or I said something too loud, and AI, you know, on our computers, when in the internet, AI is linked immediately. So AI comes on and talks to us. I hate it. I mean, somebody's talking to me and it's a machine. You say, what's wrong? What is the problem? What's happened? Did you fall on your head? Did you break your neck? What can I do for you? Call an ambulance? This is the kind of stuff that, because, you know, I move around and they think, well, you know, the guy is in some kind of crisis. Please, any other questions before I think we have to quit actually. Well, sorry for talking so long. I actually should make sure that my own discussions are shorter. I promise. So next Wednesday, we are here again. This Wednesday, I'm going to speak about Marx and Marxism and Marx's discovery of the cycle. I mean, he's the greatest thinker of the 19th century, I would say, and it would be surprising if he didn't discover the cycle. He discovered it in a kind of partial way, and that's my topic. But please, if you have not read the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, or in Hungarian, Lajos Napóleon 18-ai, Brumaire 18-ája. That would be, it's beautiful in Hungarian. It sounds really, really crazy. But, you know, this is tough to translate into any other language. I don't even know the German title, 18 Brumaire von Louis Bonaparte. Anyway, whatever language you're going to read it, I don't care. But please try to read it. And what is interesting is, if you are interested in additional bibliography, is that Marx touches on this kind of problem, democracy, how you get, what it means to get to democracy. Already on the Jewish question, 1843, he comes back to the problem of transition in his debate with Bakunin. So this is really something that comes back all the time. And why not? The 19th century is full of these changes. So he's reflecting and he's trying to address them. And that's our topic next time. Then a week from today, it will be the international dimension of these authoritarian cycles, and then an essay by Thomas Frank on the right to democracy the Monday after that. So thank you very much. I got to run because I have to do this again at the new school.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank
You
you
know,
very much. Have a nice day.
you should follow Nazan's example though, because ask questions. You know, it's really my lectures are very imperfect, and I could even be misleading you in many ways. And for example, her question said, "Aren't these ideal types?" That's how I translate Nazan's question. Aren't these ideal types? What happens if they are combined? What happens under decolonization? Aren't they combined? Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. I gotta
Thank you
go.
very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
See you, talk.